So, Asha, how is a federal judge in Texas able to reduce the accessibility of abortion across the entire country?
It's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down to a soundbite or a tweet. So, Renato, the Supreme Court has issued an administrative stay on the Texas judge's ruling banning the abortion medication Mifepristone. And the parties have been ordered to file their briefs today on that case. And this is kind of a complicated case. You and I have gone back and forth, and we've been consulting, our colleagues who are Supreme Court watchers and experts, and trying to understand all of the procedural complexities that have brought us to this point. So I feel like it would be helpful to our listeners to kind of walk through what's happened, how it's happened, why it's significant, and kind of leading up to where we are today. What do you think?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the first question in everyone's mind is, how does one judge in Amarillo, Texas, able to issue a ruling like this? I mean, I think that's a significant question. People are wondering, how do you choose to get in front of that judge, and how does that judge have that authority?
Well, it turns out when there's only one judge in a particular district, if you file a lawsuit there, you can be guaranteed to get that judge to hear the case. And that's what happened here. This is a group of doctors who filed suit in this particular district where there's only one judge. This judge had, I believe, had been an anti-abortion activist basically before becoming a federal judge. So they very much knew where he stood on this issue. And we'll get to the issue. We'll get to the standing issue in a bit, because I think that's worth talking about in terms of, how do these doctors have any standing to bring this case? But basically, this judge decided that the FDA wrongly approved this medication over 20 years ago, and as a result, issued an injunction from its further dispensation nationwide. And I think just as an initial matter, let's just unpack that for a second, because the Dobbs decision from last June claimed to be returning the decision of whether to make abortion accessible to the states, that this was going to become a state issue. You even had people like Lindsey Graham saying, we believe this decision belongs in the states. And of course, an unelected federal judge deciding to make this medication unavailable in the entire country directly goes against that. And one thing that I learned, by the way, is that this really does affect access to abortion, because over half of abortions are undertaken using this medication, not through surgical procedures. That was actually a new fact that I learned in researching this.
One thing that I learned from researching this is that the availability of this drug changed dramatically, I believe in 2021 during the pandemic, when the FDA decided to allow this to be sent via mail. And that's one reason why it is such a significant portion of the abortions in this country, because you are able to get it via the mail. You don't have to travel anywhere. And look, in a lot of states, there is very restricted access to abortion, right? So there are certain states where there might be only one or two facilities where you can get an abortion in the entire state. And of course, now there are many states in which abortion is illegal. And so this is a way in which people can potentially find a way to have an abortion and be able to get an abortion if they don't have the means to travel somewhere where they can get an abortion in a clinic, for example, right? So I think,
or presumably in places where the traveling has been criminalized.
Right. That problem as well. So, I mean, very significant in terms of its impact. And I agree with you that, one of the things underlying this, the undertone is whether this is really a state issue. I mean, you mentioned Lindsey Graham. Of course, Lindsey Graham's the same guy who proposed a nationwide abortion ban in the United States Congress. So, it is definitely going to test, and we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do, but it's really going to test the logic of the Supreme Court decision, because both the majority decision written by Justice Alito and the concurrence written by Justice Kavanaugh both really focus on the fact that this would be a state issue. That's not the case. And so, to return to sort of originally the point we were talking about, why this particular judge can make this ruling or issue this ruling. I mean, I should note that not every case can be brought in Amarillo. There has to be, some reason why typically there has to be some sort of occurrence within that district. And the person who's being sued, the entity being sued, the court has to have personal jurisdiction over them. In other words, that person needs to have some connection to that district or be, a president in that district in some way. But when you're challenging an FDA policy, you can generally, for administrative law, bring those suits anywhere. And often they're brought like in District of Columbia or someplace like that. Here, they're brought in Amarillo, I think, certainly for the reasons you suggest. And one of the big issues there, that's part of I think the criticism that the judge is getting for that ruling is the issue of standing, which I think is an important one that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Before we get to that, I just want to talk about the substance here, which is that the judge essentially second-guessed the FDA's decision based on his determination that Mifepristone incurs side effects that are dangerous. And I think that in and of itself is incredibly problematic because I have to wonder what expertise this judge has to look at medical studies and make that determination when we have an entire agency that is dedicated to doing that. But also that his conclusions are really factually incorrect and that this is an incredibly safe drug, safer than many other drugs, for example, like Viagra. I think this opens the door to, are we now in a place where random federal judges can just decide to second guess the FDA and just take entire drugs off the market? So I think there's this whole other Pandora's box that the substance of his decision opens up. And it's part of the reason that the pharmaceutical companies are, are appealing this decision as well.
Yeah, one of the main pharmaceutical companies involved here, I think there's two manufacturers, Mifepristone. One of them is Intervene. Obviously there's a lot of problems, and we're going to get to some of them in a minute about standing with the judge's ruling. But one thing I do want to point out, and I think is interesting, because I think people listen to this podcast because they like to understand the complexities and the sort of the back and forth regarding this. I mean, when you and I were in law school, Asha, there was a lot of praise from progressive professors who I think came of age in the 60s for judges making factual determinations from the bench and essentially intervening to overturn the decisions of democratically elected officials, in part because of the experience of the civil rights era, right? Where you had racist policies that were being enacted by not only school districts, but all sorts of governmental bodies, and having a nationwide injunction or a district-wide injunction coming from a federal judge who was looking at data and so on, there were certain circumstances in which that was very appropriate, and I think it was emphasized. But I think we're starting to see the flip side of that now, which is someone, like you said, I think relying on data that to be charitable is misleading data, incomplete, not not accurate, and is reaching decisions that have an impact on millions of people across the country. Essentially overturning not only, like you said, it's not only a democratically elected body, but this is I think an agency of scientists and medical professionals.
Yeah, and I think that's the key here. You may have been paying more attention in administrative law than I was, but I'm not sure what specific cases you're talking about that our professors were lauding. But I do think there is a fundamental difference between, say, policies that impact people's civil rights, which I think an ordinary person or a judge is maybe especially well suited to review, and things that require specific training and expertise. And I would say that an evaluation of the efficacy and safety of drugs is one of those things. And that's why we have an entire agency devoted to it. So the standing issue, I think, is the other problematic point here, which is that this is brought by an alliance of doctors who say that they have an interest in this issue because they may be asked to prescribe this medicine. I think that's the idea. And, they feel weird about doing that. And, the standing, which we've heard come up in different contexts over the last several years, standing refers to the fact that you have to have a particularized injury from the law or policy that you are challenging. There has to be some direct connection between what you are litigating and how it impacts you. And here, the connection between the dispensation of Mifepristone and its side effects or whatever, and these doctors seems incredibly tenuous.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important point, Asha. The reason, just so everyone listening understands, this idea of standing, a doctrine of standing, is because federal courts and courts in general, but federal, just to focus on federal courts like this one, they're supposed to be hearing when there's what's called cases and controversies, when there's an actual dispute between two people or two entities. They're not like freestanding policy makers, so they're not supposed to be just giving their opinions in real time. Like, hey, you don't like the bathroom someone's using? Well, like go to court and get a judge to give a thought about that. It's not supposed to work that way. What's supposed to happen is you're supposed to actually have suffered an injury, for example, in order to be able to be someone who can bring a lawsuit complaining about it. Because the whole purpose of these civil lawsuits is to make someone whole from an injury or prevent injuries to people, make people whole for harms that they suffer. And here, this group of doctors, their argument is that statistically, if you allow these drugs to continue to be distributed in the way that they are, that statistically they will, in their hospitals, be able, be forced to treat some people with serious injuries. That appears to not be factually true based on everything that I've read. Okay, it just appears to be straight up false. But even putting that to the side is an odd argument because, of course, the job of doctors is to treat people who are sick. It's sort of like if I was complaining as a lawyer that more people might need my legal services if a particular law was enacted. That would generally be a good thing for me as a lawyer. So it's sort of hard to understand completely what the harm is. It's very tortured, tenuous, I think very problematic.
Yeah, I'm thinking as you're saying this that I suspect that doctors have to treat the side effects of, say, smoking, more so than the side effects of Mifepristone. And tobacco is, I think, a substance that would be approved by the FDA. Could a judge come in?
Probably not.
Overrule the approval of tobacco and ban the sale of cigarettes across the country?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I mean, it's sort of bizarre, and I like I said, I don't even know if it's an injury, right? I mean, it might be a benefit to your particular hospital or your medical group, right?
It's
I mean,
giving
you have more people to
business.
treat.
Exactly. It's
Right, that's what I mean. It doesn't even make sense. I don't even understand it. If you told me more people are getting arrested and they need my legal services, well, that's not an injury to me. Maybe it's a bonus. So, I mean, it's not. That's crass way of looking at it, but I'm just saying, from the purpose of standing law, I don't know what my particularized harm would be.
Right. So it is like. I think you make a great point that it's not even clear that it's a harm to their particular interest, except, like I said, unless it just makes them feel sad or something. But really, it's sort of a circuitous, to the extent that there is an injury, it's circuitous that, some other patient incurs some side effects, which may or may not be traceable to this drug, and then they have to treat it. And then I think the third issue here is the statute of limitations, which comes up. Right. Sure. Which is that this drug was approved over 2 decades ago. And so
early, I think Clinton administration.
Mm-hmm. And so, the question is, and in administrative law, like when these drugs are approved, there's like an entire time period in which there's like notice and comment and people can object and appeal and do all kinds of stuff. Again, Renato, you may have been paying more attention in administrative law than me, so you can feel free to unpack that. But after that window passes, presumably the statute of limitations has gone. Now, there have been ongoing modifications, so-called REMS, and I forget the exact what that acronym stands for, but it gets to the additional restrictions or rules around how the drug, even after it's been approved, can be dispensed or distributed, or what the requirements are. And I think one of those, Renato, as you mentioned, was during COVID, allowing for it to be mailed, and those, I think, become separate instances, which then, push beyond the approval. You can challenge those individual restrictions within a shorter time window.
Yeah, it's a very important point, because before this went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's stay, I think, was very short. It was very limited in duration. The parties initially went to the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which is where I clerked many years ago. And the judges there kind of did what you might think of as a split the baby sort of ruling, but it's still very problematic. And they still kind of rubber stamped that standing analysis that we talked about earlier. But one thing that they do have as a difference from the district judge, the initial judge in Amarillo, is they said that there was a statute of limitations issue. And so what essentially that means is that the drug could still be sold in the United States. However, some of the more recent developments, like the ability to distribute it via mail, would be overturned by that ruling. So still very problematic, still would have a major impact, but would have a lesser impact than we originally thought it might have, which would basically mean that drug was not available, even if doctors were trying to prescribe it in person.
Right. Now, to complicate things further, meanwhile, back at the ranch, another judge who presumably had been teed up by people who, by attorneys general of many states in which abortion is legal, and who saw what was coming down the road in Amarillo, had basically filed suit in Washington state.
Right.
And that decision came down right after Judge Kaczmaryk's in Amarillo. And do you want to unpack that one?
Yeah, and that's an important point. I would just say strategically, people kind of often don't understand or wonder about why lawyers make certain choices. I think strategically it was a very savvy choice to bring that issue before a judge in a different state and have that judge essentially issue an order that is somewhat contradictory, or significantly contradictory to the order in Amarillo, because it shows to the United States Supreme Court that there's a problem with this sort of permitting this sort of thing to go forward, because everyone's going to be going to their favorite judge in their favorite state and getting ruling that could impact the entire country. And it's not really a proper use of our judiciary. It's also, I'd say something that's going to create a lot of work and hassle for the Supreme Court, which judges always care about their own interests and their own dockets. So that's the first thing I'll say about it. But the second thing is that ruling essentially, if I recall correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Ash, I believe what it does is it constrains the FDA from doing anything that would restrict the access of Mifepristone. So that obviously is in very significant tension, to put it mildly, with Judge Kaczmarek's ruling in Amarillo, because obviously some of the things that he's ordering there would contradict that order, and the FDA now can go in courts, and I think rightfully so, is saying, look, we're being told by two different judges to say two different things, which is, like I said, definitely a better litigation position for them to be in. But separately from that, the one thing that's interesting, though, of course, is that there are some ways in which Judge Kaczmarek's order in Amarillo, even as modified by the Fifth Circuit, still is operational to some extent, because the Washington court's order doesn't completely negate what he was trying to do, because there are some things that the FDA doesn't have to take action on that nonetheless may restrict access to that drug.
Right. So, again, because this is complicated, I'm referring here because I want to get it right. So this is Judge Thomas Rice in the Eastern District of Washington. And that case was brought by 18 blue states. And what they were seeking is to block, we talked about REMS, those restrictions that kind of come up or, regulate how the drug is dispensed. That in 2023, the REMS for Mifepristone included a pharmacy certification requirement. So that's the basis on which they were challenging. They were saying, we want to block that restriction. Rice's ruling did not enjoin the 2023 REMS amendment, but what it does is it prevents the FDA from imposing any further restrictions on the drug. Importantly, his is not nationwide. He limited his relief to the states that were bringing this case. So the 16 states plus DC. And so you can see how this creates like a big problem, right? The Texas judge has this nationwide ban that basically says, I'm undoing the approval from the get-go. And then you have this Washington judge who says, I guess is operating on the assumption that this is an approved drug. And by the way, the FDA cannot take any more steps to restrict its access. And so,
what a mess.
What a mess. This is, obviously something the Supreme Court is going to have to resolve. And just so people know, ideally, you're not supposed to have these sweeping decisions, right? Our judicial system is built around this idea that you may have similar issues brought up in different courts. They may rule slightly differently, and you end up with these courts are sort of supposed to be acting as laboratories to figure out the right answer so that by the time an issue may get up to the Supreme Court, they have a really good, robust, swath of jurisprudence to really look at, see how judges have approached it, and they can come up with something that is reason. So, it's not necessarily always the case that it's crazy for two different courts to rule differently on a similar issue. It's just that this happens to be a policy issue of nationwide importance, and the judge here has made the ruling applicable to everyone in the country. And so that's what's kind of creating this insanity.
Yeah, I mean, it is insane. I mean, I think it's fair to say that is exactly what the litigants wanted here in Amarillo, Texas. They filed there, and they sought this relief precisely because they were trying to affect nationwide change via a random lawsuit in Amarillo, Texas. And litigation does have that purpose at times, but I will just say I think that judges are what would be wise and are wise to have a humility about their role, and judges are best when they are trying to be prudent about how they exercise the power that they have and exercise only what is necessary to, remedy very specific wrongs in front of them. And, certainly there are times when judges have to invalidate democratically laws that are passed by democratically elected bodies because they're unconstitutional or they're violating someone's rights. But I think, it's certainly a problem when we got judges doing things like we just saw in this case. It's just not the way that the policy should be made in the United States.
I'm old enough to remember when judges who did this were called activist judges.
Pepperidge Farm remembers.
Remembers. So just to bring this full circle, so basically now there has been an administrative stay placed on Judge Kaczmarek's ruling while the parties brief the Supreme Court. And what happens now?
The practice is that in a particularly significant case like this, the application is going to go to the entire court, right, for consideration. And so we're going to have a vote soon by the United States Supreme Court that I guess will determine whether or not this is going to be placed on hold and heard by the United States Supreme Court, or potentially leaving the Fifth Circuit's ruling in place while this is considered by the court, which would restrict access to Mifepristone. Not completely, because it would still be available in person from doctors, but I think it would have a very significant impact on access to abortion, particularly in states that either have banned abortion or have just severely restricted access where, for example, it's technically legal, but there's only one or two, in-person facilities in the entire state that provide those services.
So stay tuned.
So, Asha, this week we have had yet another national security case. This one by kind of a dumbass, right? I mean, this is not like some sort of major spy or a former president of the United States. Here we've got some guy, young kid, 21 years old, trying to impress his gamer buddies on Discord. I use Discord. I'm a gamer, love gaming. Probably shouldn't be distributing national security secrets to your buddies on Discord.
Yeah, this case is really interesting. When I was having my Substack office hours last week with my class, before we knew who this person was, we were discussing it. And I said, I'm very interested in understanding this individual's motive. Mm-hmm. Because based on the kinds of things that have been released, there doesn't seem to be any like a coherent reason. It's not like this surveillance program, that I'm exposing of the U.S. government. It was just sort of a hodgepodge of different, very sensitive intelligence relating, a lot of it relating to the war in Ukraine. And I think that now that we know that this person, Jack Teixiera, was basically trying to show off in this chat room, right, kind of trying to get their, admiration of these other individuals in this, on this gaming site. It's really interesting because it's sort of a narcissism that's at play, right? Like this person, mm-hmm. I don't know if in his real life he feels unimportant or, but in this little world, he was looked up to as the leader and somebody who had all the knowledge. And in intelligence, there's this acronym called MICE, that people who are vulnerable to potentially for recruitment by foreign intelligence agencies are motivated by money, ideology, coercion, or ego. And I think ego is at play here, but it's in a kind of a new way of like the narcissism that I think is engendered through growing up in a world where everything is about how people online respond to you. And it's kind of a weird new national security threat in a way. I'll add that the other piece that was alarming to me about his motivations, or kind of his, ideology really, is he apparently, this chat room, I think was, driven by a lot of racist beliefs. Teixiera himself, expressed racist and anti-Semitic beliefs as well as anti-government beliefs. And I think it really points to a problem we have about extremism in the military. And that's something that we've seen over and over again.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, it also, I think, points to, I think, the youth of our military. I mean, one thing that was interesting to me is as soon as this became public, a lot of people were like, how does a kid who's 18, 19, whatever he was when he first got access to this stuff, have access to such important classified materials? And there was a lot of ex-military folks who spoke up. Charlotte Clymer was one of them, but many others who were like, hey, the military is very young. When I was 18 or when I was 19 in the military, I had access to stuff like this. And that's just how the military is. Most people in the military are in their 20s or 30s. They don't look like these grizzled, like Charlotte showed me that the grizzled colonel you see in these movies, the commanding a platoon, is not real life. Like in real life, a colonel might be in their early 40s or something. So I think it's interesting because, look, I mean, you know, you have teenagers, I believe. I have a teenage stepdaughter and her friends, and her occasionally do foolish things. So, you know, it's not surprising entirely that a teenager might do something stupid. Here, I agree that he's influenced by extremist ideology. I mean, I think that's a problem with our sort of online world right now in general, right? I mean, this extremism that has been really, I'd say, cultivated by the right is exploding online too, not just in the military, but online through, you know, right-wing memes and so on. And I mean, it's worth noting that Mr. Teixiera, even after being arrested in his home by the FBI, is being defended by the likes of Donald Trump Jr. and Marjorie Taylor Greene as some sort of, you know, right-wing hero. When it doesn't appear to me, while yes, he was anti-government and or, you know, had some expressed some racist views, it seems to me like he was not really an ideologue, but more of like a young kid. Like you said, ego is the right term in your fancy acronym, which is this is a kid who wanted to impress his friends. And some people might drive their dad's car and wreck it to impress their friends if you're Ferris Bueller's friend or something. But here it's like here's someone distributing our national security secrets, and I think he's going to pay a very significant price in terms of a prison sentence and a felony conviction for his bad choices.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what is driving the defense of him from these people on the right, except that maybe it's another way to suggest that this is a Biden, you know, this is happening under Biden's watch, or it also helped Russia, you know, and we know that one common thread among these people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump Jr., is that they're very pro-Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And it really exposed a lot of what we know. I mean, in the first rule of intelligence is never let your adversary know what you know. So it not only gives them an advantage in the substance of them understanding how we view and our allies view the war and its weaknesses and, you know, vulnerabilities, et cetera. But they also can look at the specific intelligence and potentially reverse engineer where it came from, which can put sources and methods and even lives in danger. I think it's really interesting on the age point because I think the age and the anti-government beliefs kind of intersect, right? Because imagine that you have somebody who's super patriotic, you know, that helps to inculcate, even if they're young and have access to this, that this is something that needs to be protected. For someone who's young, who may not fully appreciate the ramifications of this and who doesn't believe in the goals of government. I mean, like, this is someone who did not fully believe in the oath he took to even be in the military. Then you can see like that, he doesn't really see the downside to exposing this. He believes that it's fine to take matters into your own hands and show the truth to his gaming buddies or whatever. Or at least like self-rationalize in that way. So I think it's like a real big problem that the military needs to deal with. The other thing I'll say is, this is sort of the downstream effects of what happened after, or kind of the reforms that were made after 9/11. I mean, 9/11 highlighted that we were not sharing intelligence quickly enough, widely enough. And so a lot of what we have put together since then are mechanisms to ensure the flow of intelligence and information across agencies, across the military, which means that there's more eyes than ever before on these sensitive secrets. It may have been a time where this would have just been on hard copy in some room that only grisly generals would have seen. But then, that meant that other people in the FBI or CIA or NSA would not see it. And so, and because this involves technological infrastructure, I think you have more of these IT guys that are, or women involved in the infrastructure of allowing this intelligence to be shared. So I think, it's how many people have top secret clearances now? I think 3 million in our government. That's crazy. I mean, and by the way, that doesn't mean they all have a need to know and they all are allowed to see everything, because I think that's another issue is, are people seeing things that they really have no need to know? Yeah.
Really interesting question. That's why, you bring a perspective here as somebody who did counterintelligence work that I don't. I think it's fascinating. I think, just to hook on one thing you said, you mentioned why why are these people going so hard at defending Mr. Teixiera? I think one reason why is because it goes into this narrative they have that the FBI and DOJ are being weaponized against Republicans, right? It makes the Trump seem like he's part of a pattern, right? They're going after him for criming. And this guy, he's just because he's anti the Ukraine war. That was the way Donald Trump Jr. is trying to spin it. This guy was against the Ukraine war, so they're going after him. Not really. They're going after him because he's a dumbass who distributed classified documents on his gaming Discord. But it is what it is. For what it's worth, I'll say, sort of bringing, my experience to this, I do think a judge will take into account his age. Judge is going to take into account the circumstances of the offense. Any judge has to under statute. And I suspect a sentence is somewhere in the, let's say 2 to 9 year range. A friend of mine who actually he tweets under Secrets and Laws on Twitter. We were talking about it. He thought in the higher end of that range. I think maybe more in the lower end of that range. And so we'll see which of the two of us is right. But nonetheless, very significant sentence and life-changing for a young person who is a convicted felon and spending some time in federal prison.
Yeah. And one thing that I noted was he totally knew what he was doing was wrong, because as soon as he learned from his chat group that these had gone into the broader world beyond that group, he was like, I'm screwed. And he knew that they were going to find him. So, I'll be interested to see what happens. Too bad this guy threw his life away.
Yeah. Too bad, not just for him, but for so many people who potentially had their lives endangered by the distribution of that content.
Completely. So, Renato, before we go, we had a request to talk about some of our favorite TV, crime shows. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I have to tell you that in the last couple of weeks, I started watching Night Agent on Netflix, which started out promising, but I gave up within 3 episodes because it's more of the conspiracy thing. There's some conspiracy in the White House and everybody's getting too close to the truth. Every time somebody gets too close to the truth, they die. And, Is it the CIA? Is it the Secret Service? Is it the White House Chief of Staff? And I'm just like, I'm so over it. Though now now I pick up Pancake and I tell him that he's getting too close to the truth.
Sounds almost sinister. So yeah, here I'll tell everyone a secret, sort of a secret. I mean, there are so many law shows out there, and I'm sure you have a similar experience because you're in the FBI, and there's all these FBI shows, right? Like Class of whatever. There's always feds, rookie feds, right? There's tons of shows about FBI agents, but there's lots and lots of shows about prosecutors and federal prosecutors investigating crime. And most of them are like total BS, right? And it's very hard for me to watch those shows because every time I watch them, I'm like, I remember there was one time and my wife was laughing. It's like, objection. Like I was saying objection from the other room because she had something on. This was during COVID. And I'm like, objection, from the other room because it was what they were saying was totally improper. It's almost comical. Like when you watch Law and Order and like the putative defendant, or the person who's going to be accused is in some conference room with the prosecutors, and then he just confesses everything, to the prosecutors. It's just absurd. So it's hard for me to take it seriously. Now, one show that I watched after I already had been a federal prosecutor investigating narcotics trafficking that still had a big impact on me was The Wire.
I haven't watched it, but I've been told to.
Yeah, that's a ridiculously good show. I mean, that's like a work of art, like a novel or something. And that's like a true work of art, that show. But it's state court prosecutors. There are certain things where I'm like, come on, did they really, could they really prove PC, or we would never interact with a judge that way. But I can't completely judge how, state practice would be in Baltimore. But it was nonetheless, there was a lot of truth to it. It was trying to be an interesting but yet a show that revealed a lot. So I thought that show was just absolutely exceptional. One thing that's really hard for me to watch, probably the hardest thing for me to watch, and that's probably subject of a whole other episode, is true crime, because somebody spent a lot of time investigating crime. Some of it hits too close to home for me.
Yeah. So I'm with you. I do not watch a lot of FBI shows. I wasn't in the FBI then, but I never watched X-Files. Like, that's not what got me interested in the FBI. What else? I started watching Homeland, and I cut it out after the first episode because it's like Claire Danes is CIA, and she like wakes up a judge in the middle of the night and asks for a FISA order, and I was like, this just makes no sense to me, and I can't deal with this. So that was how.
See?
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's just so dumb. You know what I mean? I was like, you can't even.
It's so dramatized.
It was unnecessary. Like, why would you just make it so inaccurate like that? So, I will say the one show that I loved, that I think, really conveys, I think, the heart of what counterintelligence is about is The Americans. I love that show. I thought it was really well done.
I watched the first couple years of that, or seasons of that. That was very good.
It's Hollywoodized. The FBI generally, does not extrajudicially kill people or, sleep with their sources or pass classified information to Russia, but overall, I think it captured the vibe of the spy versus spy thing. And I think it was the storyline, which was really more about the relationship of this KGB couple, was really interesting. And which is based on, by the way, the illegals program that the Department of Justice busted back in 2010. This is tangentially related to counterintelligence, but I still think it's a really good series, is Turn, Washington Spies.
Oh, I've never seen that.
It's really good. It's about like the Culpeper spy ring during the Revolutionary War.
That's super interesting. Yeah, Americans, I totally could see that. And by the way, the whole point you mentioned, capturing the essence, is sort of what The Wire does for drug investigations and prosecutions. A couple kind of off the wall things that I will say is, my cousin Vinny's cross-examination is actually used a lot of times in trial ed classes as a way of, it's like a funny way to talk about it, because it's actually quite, like, some of the questioning there is quite good. And I do think Legally Blonde is kind of fun, and there are some truths in that, right? That's like a fun
I'm glad you brought up Legally Blonde. I used to use Legally Blonde when I was a dean of admissions at Yale Law School. I would tell admitted students that scene could only have happened at Yale Law School because Connecticut, allows first-year law students to appear in court under the supervision of an attorney, and Massachusetts does not. And so, that was just a whole propaganda thing for Harvard Law School.
Yeah, what was up with that? I mean, come on. If she had that great of an Elsetsker, she would have gone to Yale anyway.
Right.
So, anyway.
MSW Media.